A Map of Thought, Episode 33, The Big Story. Almost every argument you will see online this week is not actually new. It is one of maybe 7 arguments, invented by people who have been dead for centuries, wearing a new outfit. Today, we take the whole map down off the wall and trace those 7 arguments from the very first one to the very last.
Let us start where the whole series started. What is the first question?
What is a good life, and what is a just society? Aristotle answered it by watching real Athenian city constitutions and building an ethics around habit and balance. Confucius answered it by watching a political order collapse and building a system around ritual and named relationships. Ibn Khaldun answered it centuries later by watching dynasty after dynasty rise on group loyalty and rot within a few soft, comfortable generations. 3 completely different starting points, 3 different continents, and yet all 3 were chasing the exact same target, what actually holds people together and makes their shared life worth living. Neither one has ever fully won that argument. You can still hear its echo anytime someone argues over whether a company exists to make shareholders rich or to make its own people's working lives genuinely good.
From justice, the map moves to wealth. How do we actually create prosperity?
This is where an entire school of thought gets its name. Classical liberalism, built by Adam Smith, David Hume, David Ricardo, and eventually John Stuart Mill. Their shared bet was that free individuals, trading voluntarily, largely left alone by government, would produce more genuine prosperity than any central planner ever could. Smith gave us the invisible hand and the division of labor. Ricardo gave us comparative advantage. Malthus gave the whole optimistic story its first serious scare, warning that population would always outrun food. Mill spent his career trying to keep the whole framework honest, adding liberty and reform on top of pure market logic. Here is the hook worth sitting with. Every single trade war headline you have read this year is the exact same argument Ricardo and Malthus were already having 2 centuries ago, just running on container ships and semiconductors instead of wool and grain.
And prosperity, once it actually arrives, does not land evenly. That is the next question.
Why does inequality and conflict persist? Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels gave classical liberalism its most serious rival, an entire school called Marxism, arguing that the market Smith celebrated was actually a mechanism for extracting value from workers, and that history moves through class conflict, not gradual improvement. Antonio Gramsci then asked the question that should have broken Marx's prediction entirely. If workers are genuinely being exploited this badly, why are not they revolting? His answer was cultural hegemony, ordinary people consenting to a system that does not serve them, because the ideas justifying that system have soaked into everything: education, entertainment, common sense itself. Here is a genuine hook most people miss. Gramsci's insight, written from inside a fascist prison cell, is the direct ancestor of an entire later school called critical theory, built by a group of thinkers known as the Frankfurt School, Theodor Adorno, Max Horkheimer, and later Herbert Marcuse, working in Germany and then in American exile after fleeing the Nazis. They took Gramsci's basic move, power working through culture and consent rather than just force, and pushed it even further, arguing that mass media, advertising, and popular entertainment could manufacture the very desires and consent that kept an unequal system running smoothly, with people barely noticing they had been shaped at all. Mitchell Foucault later pushed that same instinct into prisons, hospitals, and schools, showing how power operates through everyday discipline rather than a single ruler's command. Pierre Bourdieu closed this whole thread by showing that inequality reproduces itself quietly through taste and education, not just through wages.
So if power runs through culture as much as economics, how does a society avoid simply falling apart under all that conflict?
That is exactly the next question the map asks, and it produced an entire sociological tradition. Emile Durkheim answered it with social facts and solidarity. Georg Simmel answered it by watching how money and city life reshaped the individual psyche. Max Weber answered it with bureaucracy and the iron cage of rationalization. Talcott Parsons tried to turn all of that into one grand, unified theory of society as a functioning system, and dominated the field for decades before conflict theorists tore that theory apart for quietly excusing every inequality it studied as somehow necessary. Douglas North then brought this same question into economics directly, arguing that institutions, the actual rules of the game, explain why some nations get rich and others stay trapped, a school of thought now called New Institutionalism. Here is the hook. Every single argument you have ever had about whether your own workplace is functional or just badly broken is a Parsons versus his critics argument, running quietly in the background of your own career.
And meaning itself, how people actually experience all of this day to day, got its own thread as well.
George Herbert Mead and Herbert Bloomer showed that even your own private sense of self is built entirely through interaction with other people. Clifford Geertz scaled that same insight up to entire cultures, arguing a society is a web of meaning its own members spin themselves. Put those two together, and you get a genuinely useful lens for reading anything from a Balinese cockfight to a modern social media profile the exact same careful way.
From meaning, the map turns to motion. What actually drives change?
Joseph Schumpeter's answer was creative destruction, capitalism tearing down old industries to build new ones forever. Mariana Mazzucato pushed back on the myth Schumpeter helped build, showing that the risky research behind almost every celebrated private breakthrough was quietly funded by the public sector first. Marshall McLuhan showed that the format carrying an idea reshapes society as much as the idea itself. Manuel Castells mapped how power now flows through global networks as much as through fixed places. Zeynep Tufekci showed exactly where those fast networks fall short, brilliant at gathering a crowd overnight, far weaker at building the patient organization needed to actually negotiate afterward. And running underneath, this entire cluster sits one more live argument, an entire school called Keynesian economics, built on the idea that government should actively manage demand during downturns, against a later school called neoliberalism, built on the idea that markets manage themselves best with government mostly out of the way. That argument has never actually been settled. It just changes which decade's headlines it is wearing.
Which brings us to the map's last honest question. Whose interests do these systems actually serve, and what do we do next?
Amartya Sen answered it by proving famine is a political failure, not a food shortage, and that real development means expanding what people can actually do and be, not just how much they earn. James Buchanan answered it by turning the same skeptical lens back onto government itself, treating politicians and bureaucrats as self-interested actors, not saints, a school now called public choice. Thomas Piketty answered it with centuries of tax data, showing that wealth, left alone, tends to compound faster than the wages most people actually live on. And Daron Acemoglu closed the loop entirely, arguing that institutions, not resources or culture, explain why some nations thrive and others do not, and asking whether artificial intelligence right now is being built to share its gains broadly, or to concentrate them narrowly, exactly the same choice colonial administrators made centuries ago, still visible today in a single satellite photograph of a divided peninsula.
Let us make all of this personal for a second, because 33 thinkers is a lot to hold at once.
Think about a single argument in an ordinary household or office over who gets credit for a shared success, and who has to absorb the blame when something goes wrong. Someone is quietly making an Aristotle argument about what fairness actually requires here. Someone else is making a Marx argument about who is doing the real work and who is simply capturing the reward. Someone is making a Weber argument about whether the official rules or the actual informal power in the room are what really decides the outcome. Someone is making a Buchanan argument, wondering whether the person in charge is acting for the group's benefit or quietly protecting their own position. That one small, ordinary argument over fairness and credit is the entire map, running in miniature in a kitchen or a conference room this week.
And that is really the whole point of walking through all 33 of these, is not it? Not to end up with one final answer.
Exactly that. Every single argument raging in the news right now. Artificial intelligence quietly reshaping who works and who owns the gains. Wealth concentrating faster than wages can keep up. Entire populations losing trust in the institutions meant to hold their societies together. Fast networked movements winning viral attention and then struggling to turn it into anything lasting is simply one of these same 7 or 8 arguments, dressed in this decade's specific clothing. None of these thinkers actually defeated the others. Aristotle did not defeat Confucius. Smith did not defeat Marx. Buchanan did not defeat Sen. They are all still arguing through us, every time we argue about fairness, power, and who a system is really built to serve. So here is the honest way to close 2,500 years of this. The goal was never to hand you one final, correct answer, packaged up neatly at the end of episode 33. The goal was to teach you to recognize the conversation itself, clearly enough that the next time you hear it, in a boardroom, in a headline, in your own kitchen, you know exactly which old argument you are actually standing inside, and you can finally choose on purpose which side of it you want to be on. Thank you for walking the whole map with us.
See you next time.